Hi, I'm Emily Gong, and welcome to Art Focus Spoken. Our mission is to feature the voices of artists and unite creative communities across the globe. We aim to do this amid COVID-19 in our ongoing series called Creating Through Crisis. On today's episode, we are excited to speak with Lillian Liu, an award-winning photographer who specializes in creative fine art photography with digital elements. Notable features of her work include Vogue Taiwan and Mary Claire Taiwan. Lillian is also a pianist with a master's degree in classical performance from the Royal College of Music in London, and is a full-time music teacher and collaborates with other artists. Today, Lillian is speaking with us from the comforts and safety of her home in Vancouver, Canada. Lillian, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I am doing great. It is around 8:30 in the morning, and I'm just waking up.
You appear more awake than any of us in the later time zones, so
I'm a good actress.
really admire that about you. So for listeners who may not know you yet, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your work across the different artistic disciplines?
Sure. So funny enough, I didn't think I would ever really do the whole photography gig. When I was little, my parents were always quite invested in my musical education. So that was my main thing for up until I was about 15. And then I picked up a camera, and then it kind of started to steamroll a little bit from there. But essentially, I followed the music path because, one, I spent a lot of time as a child and as a teenager kind of just honing it because it was something that really spoke to me. But at the same time, I couldn't deny my love for visual arts. So you could essentially merge those worlds together, but you do need to pursue both of those disciplines separately as well. So in a way, I created more work for myself by following two paths, but that is what makes me happy. So essentially with music, I kind of follow the traditional route a little bit of, classical music. You have your one-on-one lessons with your teachers, you play gigs when you can, and you collaborate with other musicians and you teach. And maybe the more non-traditional aspect of it is maybe I work with other artists who might not necessarily be classical artists. Whereas with photography, perhaps I didn't quite get the formal education for it. So it was just a kid back then playing around and it built up into something. So one is formal and one's more informal, and they both suddenly, I guess, merged into their own disciplines that I do chase quite seriously right now.
Very cool. And how do you find the balance between the two?
I have to learn how to still find a balance between the two. So in essence, I feed myself through teaching a lot of the time. And that unfortunately does take up a large chunk of the day, especially because you need to find the hours that work for students that are often younger. So I find some ungodly hours of the day to start working on my photography, which is usually past midnight, but you can work without interruption then at the same time. So I guess I balance my way that way.
Thanks for sharing that. And so talking about kind of your work and your workflow and how you kind of balance the hours of like teaching with editing photos and I guess shooting too, but I imagine you're not doing much shooting these days.
No, not at all.
Has like your routine changed in these times?
Well, I'm stuck at home. Because normally I travel between 3 different schools of music to teach, and then on Fridays I take that time to either do shooting and meeting up with people or editing. And now nobody or close to nobody is shooting in Vancouver just because of the whole situation right now, but also all of the schools have shut down. So what that means is my iPad is now my best friend, and it is also now the educational institution that we are now working at. And it's been interesting because I think the mentality sometimes is that you have this little window that's connecting you to work, but then you have all the comforts of home around you. And sometimes I can imagine how difficult that might be for smaller kids to have their toys literally an arm's reach, like arm's length around, an arm's length away from their workspace. And so that has been a little bit difficult for me to try and get, things in focus. But I think they're, getting used to it now, which is nice. And for photography, it's a little uninspiring at the moment because I would love to shoot new things, but all I can look at are sketches. And of course, there are always old shoots to catch up on, but sometimes you need a bit of new blood to get the old shoots that you didn't get to quite figure out yet, that kick in the butt a little bit.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and I remember because how I first met you was in Europe. So what's that part of that aspect of your work that entails you to travel?
Even though I'm based in Vancouver right now, I did spend time in the UK because of my studies. But funny enough, it was actually kind of where I really started getting serious about my photography as well. So in a way, it was kind of funny that, and mildly unfortunate, but also wonderful that I set up my roots there. So it's easy to always return to your roots and just work with people that are already established in your life and in your circle. The difficult part is that it is a little far from me now, but I am a creature of habit, and I love working with people who know me personally on a deeper level, so they can just kind of see and understand my process with me.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. And so we've been speaking a lot about your work. Could you show us some examples of your work as well as the workspace that you're in and kind of your setup?
Sure. I will just pull up some of my work here. And in the meantime, for my workspace, I will just lift up my iPad. You can see that it's a little bit of bit of a mess right now, but I have my really cute where is he? There, my little cute gargoyle. He's a little toad, and he keeps me inspired. And there we go. And how grumpy he looks kind of reflects how I feel sometimes when I get frustrated with things. I'm a game controller because I do like taking breaks sometimes. It's really bad. My Claymore letter opener. I don't know if you can see that over there. And then my keyboard is my general setup. Some of my work is there on my computer screen, which I will share later. And of course, I have my print here. It is actually a failed print, but this is one of my favorite shoots, and I just wanted it in front of me all the time so I could take inspiration from it. And of course, a historical character I find fascinating here on my pencil case. That's Mr. Alexander the Great, and it's also inspiration. And I do share my office space, so this is the other side of it. But on my screen here is some of my work. This is just my Instagram. I did post a comparison. Sorry, I'm trying to maneuver this camera here. I'm not sure if you can see this. Is that better? That's better, I think. Yeah, I did post a comparison yesterday of my old work versus new work. This is one of my latest pieces right here, and just kind of a look through at some of my visuals. I'm not sure if this is clear. I'm sorry if it isn't.
And we'll attach links so that people can go visit your site as well and have a closer look. And so you have a very notable style. And how did you develop that style?
Oh, thank you. I was always really inspired by paintings, and I kind of always wished I could be a painter, but it never really happened. So I think I wanted to kind of incorporate that element of that one fascination I had into my regular work, because I always felt that, we could get realism in waking life. Why not kind of give it an extra punch in the sort of visual medium when possible? And initially I started by literally physically painting on the pictures, printing them out and just kind of experimenting. And that didn't work, but it kind of gave me a couple of ideas. And I discovered that you can actually digitally paint a little late in life, and it kind of steamrolled from there. So a lot of my pieces, they do have elements where I'm adding in colors and things that I'm painting in by the brush stroke, but with my tablet pen. So
Cool. And one of the first things I notice is like captures of light in your work and how you play with light and shadow. And there's like these like I don't know how to explain it, but I think like bright splashes or like kind of like reflections around. And so like is that something that developed over time or like what's something that inspired those elements in your work?
yeah, I think I've always really liked the idea of natural light and how it sort of blooms within the camera, or like how you see it sometimes, but it's a little bit difficult to capture on the physical picture. And sometimes I think exaggerating that to make it look a little bit more uh, extra human, so to say, or, ethereal is always just a little bit more fun. And I'm really inspired just by light and shadow as well in traditional art. And I think that if you add those elements in, there's almost a bit more dimension, I guess, to the image itself. I mean, I think one of the things I really struggled with earlier when I started doing this whole painting thing was that the subject becomes quite flat. And then everything, while it's nicely retouched and, taken care of and the colors are nice, there is a sense of, it feels like you're looking at a flat drawing on a page. It doesn't feel immersive. So it's something I'm still trying to improve at this point. But I think that the light and the shadow and the light and shadows really are important in getting the viewer more immersed in your work.
Thanks for sharing that. And for your process too, because a lot of the times it's the end work that the public sees, and we don't really see kind of the process that you go through in creating it. And what's a key aspect of your process that is not really evident in the work, in your photograph at the end?
Ooh. I think for myself, um, it's very hard to describe how intuitive some of it has to be. I know that this aspect becomes difficult, for example, when you might have a paying client who wants something right on a certain deadline, and then you might not be in the right headspace to create it necessarily, but then you have to make it happen, and that's part of the professionalism that is expected. But for work to come out very seamlessly sometimes, I think mental headspace is extremely important. And for me, I don't think that's necessarily dictated by my surroundings. Like, I can work anywhere, I think, but I think it has to do a lot with whether I can see the final product in my head right when I see a raw image. And if I have to work to get to that final image in my head by letting it sit, then that means that I might not have fulfilled my own duties as the photographer well enough during the shoot itself. So I would say that during the shoot, it's actually very crucial that I can give myself that really good roadmap for me to then kind of let my imagination play by giving myself enough variety to choose from. So I think that sort of pressure on the shoot itself is something that I've never really enjoyed, but I realize that it's a must. And people who've worked with me know that I like to take my insurance shots all the time, just in case, to ensure that I have something, because I think oftentimes the other part that's never really shown to other people is that I will sit on just a raw image and literally just look at it. I will stare. And sometimes people wonder what I'm doing, but I'm staring because I'm trying to imagine it in different situations. And there's a lot of that going on. And then you just have to sort of trust the process afterwards and see what comes of it.
Well, so in your process, is it that, like, how do you develop the internal vision for the shoot? Is it like you do that in advance and then?
I think there's always an element of unknown in a shoot, especially because you are working with other individuals. And of course, the weather can change that day and someone could be sick or not feeling so well. So anything can change the day of. But I think you can, save yourself as much trouble as possible beforehand by coming in with sort of a premeditated set of ideas, such as, am I trying to first of all, am I shooting close-ups, portraits, or full length? How dramatic or how subtle do I want this to be? What is the color story? Like all of these you can plan ahead of time. And then, what model should I use that can help me convey these emotions? Like, does he or she have a strong, stern face, maybe a sad face? All of these things you can plan for. And then during the shoot, sometimes all of these ideas can go out the window, but at least you kind of have the reassurance that if things go in a very streamlined manner, that you have a really clear roadmap. And then you take it from there in post.
And then so from there, you talked about how you'll sit with the images that you have and look at them and kind of envision them further of how they can develop. So like, what is kind of that process like?
Yeah, that process, I think, is definitely more experimental or intuitive than premeditated for sure. And it's because usually I get about 1 or 2 edits per set that are really, really, really final, And the first one is the one that sparks first, and it's closer to maybe the spirit of what the actual shoot was like. It's a little bit more real in that sense. Whereas the second image always comes after sitting for a while, and then I would look at it, and then I will try to imagine, what would this look like if I added in artificial light and shadow? Does this change the mood? If I add in other elements like more fabric, animals, or if I change specific components of your background, does this change who the character is? What if I merged this picture with another picture? What happens there? And then there's a lot of that sort of trial and error. And then when there is a clear story that comes out from that, then I can start fine-tuning the details. But I think the key thing is whether I can envision that raw file in a new setting.
That's really cool. It sounds like you do a lot of character building and story writing as you go along.
Yeah.
So what are elements that you take from, is it like stories that inspire you, or like kind of what's kind of like your visual library in this sense in your internal world?
I think I think it's not necessarily a specific story that being referenced all the time. Sometimes it is, but I think generally I have to be able to I have to be able to place the subject within the context of a story if I wanted to. So in that sense, there are a few things that are quite important to me. One is if the story is from the Italian Renaissance or something in my head, does the makeup and clothing match in a sense, Or if the costumes aren't necessarily accurate because there's fantasy involved, what elements of realism can I bring in, to immerse the viewer into this sort of believable fantasy? Or if I'm inspired by folk tales and stuff, which I am from many different countries, what little visual cues from said fairy tales or folk tales can I kind of sneak in? So they don't necessarily have to be very blatant details, but I think little clues generally tie the piece together. So I would say folk tales are something that are pretty interesting to me overall, along with I would say general fantasy, I think, has always been something that's been a part of my life. So I would say that's also something that is really, really influential on me. And I think the other things that are influential to me as well are writing my own stories, often fairy tale inspired, such as, is there a moral to the story of this character? What is the role of this character? Are they is this within the crux of a moment in a story? Can people pick through different ideas in the images to piece together their own story? And I think the opportunity for viewers to kind of create their own plot line, so to speak, is something that I really like giving people the opportunity to do sometimes. So it's always really nice when I get comments about people saying, oh, this inspired me to write a little story about this person, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's good.
And that also shows like kind of how versatile your characters are. I guess people can see like elements of their own favorite fantasy in a way in your own work. And so like if we backtrack a little bit too, I'm curious, what was like one of the first fantasies or stories that you worked on in your maybe one of your first shoots ever?
Well, funny enough, the very first fantasy book I read, which was Lion the Witch in the Wardrobe. I never got to do a shoot for that, but I'm planning a shoot for that, which is very late. But I would say that in terms of earlier work, I'm just trying to look through everything here just to see. Sorry, my brain. My brain. I was always really fascinated with sort of fairies in a way too, and the fact that they're neither good nor truly evil sometimes. They simply are, and they're mischievous, and of course there are benevolent ones as well as ones that are a little malicious. So I remember one of the earlier shoots I did with a beautiful firefly path gown that was black, that sort of reflected the Unseelie court. I completely was enamored with that one, and I think that was one of my earlier turning points, just kind of capturing a darker fairy.
Thanks for sharing. And I'm really curious too to learn more about your journey and specifically about how you're able to make a career from merging your passions, which is really amazing.
It's a lot of time juggling. I would say that's like the good majority of it. I think it's forced me to confront the fact that I am terrible with time management, but it's helped me improve lots in that very sense. So I think the most important part of this journey in terms of when I was first starting it was kind of realizing that it was okay to feed a passion that was not necessarily a profession at the time, because the profession at the time was music, and photography was the passion. It's okay to feed that passion slowly, and that you can't compare your success or your skill level and your accomplishments to something that you've literally been slaving away at since you were a kid. And for that, in order to improve, you would need to put in the same amount of time and patience and love into the passion to really nurture it into something that you can call a profession, but you need to make the time for it. So I would say I always put away 1 day a week to really kind of just play around and do the whole photography thing, while I would put my attention into music on the other days, because at the time it was, a much more of the only other big demand I had in my life. And then going forward, something else that I realized was very important for the journey was how to properly do project management. And it was something that didn't come naturally right away, but then you realize that you start needing to become quite proficient at making call sheets, organizing timetables, getting the communication straight, especially with teams larger than 3 people. I think if you have an entire film crew with you on that day or something, you really need to be on top of the organizational aspect. And that was very unnatural for me and quite difficult. But that was a skill set that I had to force myself to learn in the process. So I would say that's also a very important part of the journey. And then the other important element of that learning process through the journey was, I would say, the ability to kind of communicate and, you know, meet and interact with all sorts of different people. You really have to be able to have a stranger in your home, essentially, make them comfortable enough to be vulnerable with you so they can start showcasing and becoming the characters that you want. Or you might get makeup artists coming in and you need them to be on the same page as you through a 20-minute meeting, you know? So I would say that communication, people skills were also something that you had to really, you know, work on throughout the process. And I would say that's actually an extremely important part of the whole journey as well, because you can't get the, you know, the things that you were envisioning previously unless you can convey them to everyone who's on your team and who's supposed to be cooperating with you. So that sort of team leader role is quite vital, even though it was very foreign to me at the time. So yeah, that was a little peek, I guess, into maybe things that were important in my journey as a photographer.
Thanks for sharing. And you spoke a little bit about how like photography didn't take off really until you were in London doing your master's or around that time. So was that like a passion project to start with, but now you're getting like more commissions and spending more time on it?
Yeah, I would say it did start off as a passion project. So essentially, before London, I was shooting, but maybe shooting like once every 4 months, once every 5 months, because it was just like a fun thing, right? And I was also quite preoccupied with my other studies and everything. And in London, yes, the studies were crazy, but then I realized that a lot of the people that kind of liked the same universe I did, you know, they were located in that city. Just because it's such a big city, you're bound to find at least a few people, actually more than a few people, quite a few people that are on the same page as you. So it was just about locating and reaching out to specific individuals from there. And because it was such a dense city, it made it extremely easy to just navigate, especially as someone who's new, because the turnover rate of people in that city is so high that you're bound to find new people who are, you know, looking and seeking to find friends and stuff. So it was easy to set up there, I think.
Nice. And so how about like, because you were like focusing a lot of time on music and because that's kind of your main focus. And so how does music and photography inspire each other or have a dialogue or like how does that fit together?
I think it is quite closely related in a sense. I mean, I guess my teachers in music always told me to think visually when I was playing. And that was always something very strange to me until I kind of realized what they meant. And it's because I think people in general associate so much with what they see. You know, color inspires mood, right? Different shapes and, you know, compositions of things. I think a lot of things evoke feeling in people, whether it's, you know, the way the furniture is arranged in a house, you know, minimalism versus something so extravagant like Baroque art or something. And I think because we're so used to correlating a lot of visual aspects with how we feel, sometimes thinking of things as visual can often, I think, enhance the way you deliver the idea. So if a melody is urgent, you could think, why is it urgent? Like in the context of this, is the rhythmic is the rhythm reminiscent of, you know, rain? Is it reminiscent of horse hoofbeats or something? You know, thinking of these little ideas can start painting kind of an image for your audience, and I think it just makes the sound more effective. So I think thinking of musical ideas as visual kind of actually influenced the photography side too, in the sense that I would approach the idea of color kind of in the same way for storytelling and approach the idea of atmosphere, kind of in a similar sense. Because in music, you have to build atmosphere through sound only. And that might mean piecing together certain notes so carefully so that the sound travels through into the other bars, but doesn't overtake maybe more important melodies that are coming in later. So it's all about kind of fine-tuning that degree of control and creating depth in the sound. You could almost say the same for pictures and art and stuff, the sort of different light and dark and little details not trying to take away from the main idea, etc., etc. So I think it's a little abstract, but to me, at least in my head, I think it does make sense.
That's fascinating. It sounds like the method that you use for both are actually quite similar, even though the thing that you're doing is really different.
I think the approach is quite similar too. And I think one thing that also came from the whole music thing that influences my photography is the idea that when you approach a piece, to play it well, you need to understand, or at least try to appreciate, what country it comes from, what time period it comes from. Perhaps if it was relevant, maybe what social class the writer was, the composer was, kind of what was their situation, maybe the context of the piece, if it was influenced by, is it religious, is it secular, and all that stuff. And I think approaching my photography, I think I kind of have a similar route, like if I am doing a specific fairy tale, maybe when does this fairy tale, like what time period does this fairy tale fit in? Or if I bend it to a different time period, how can I adapt these elements? And maybe what specific hairstyles were popular during this time? And then it kind of all has to fit a little bit. So
that's really interesting. It sounds like you need to do a lot of contextual research for both. And so, like, what genre of music do you play? And do you also like perform for it? Like, can you tell us a bit more about your musical side?
Sure. So I was raised with classical piano, but I don't limit myself necessarily to just one genre, I would say. Of course, classical piano is what I'm the most versed in, but in terms of creative collaborations, I've been doing a lot of collaborations with bands too, who need maybe certain lines that need to be written, and then perhaps they don't have the right instrument, or maybe they would prefer the lines coming from someone who does play the piano, and usually I just provide input there. I do perform sometimes, but it's not nearly as frequent as when I was studying, just because the teaching is complete madness. But I remember fondly one of the last larger gigs I did, which was actually in Paris, and it was with my wonderful friends at Free Spirit where it was a nonprofit, and we we sent all the money for tree planting. And also to fund a school and orphanage as well, which was really something special.
Wow, that's amazing. And so nowadays, how does that look like? Is it like most of your time you spend teaching music? And then how much time do you also spend on commissions?
Yeah, I would say teaching is the main source of time. The main thing that consumes time right now, I think, and because it feeds the best essentially, and it's also very consistent. Commissions for photography, I tend to try and limit sometimes because of the whole balance thing, and I would hate to not be able to deliver necessarily if my schedule doesn't allow me to work on it honestly and diligently and stuff. So I would say I limit myself to a certain amount of commissions with photography a year. And that also allows me to do personal work and give the commissions the time they deserve, and also try and practice, even though that's been sacrificed a little bit for the teaching in at least the last year.
I see. And it's really difficult now too. Another layer of it is that you're teaching music virtually. And like, how's that shift been?
It hasn't been easy. I know it's been easier for my students who are older because they're able to keep their attention and they're able to sort of be more independent. It is quite difficult for the younger ones who might need you to hold their hand a little bit because you can't be there to physically help them with things that might confuse them. So in a sense, it is good that they're getting this experiment and opportunity to try and be more independent, to try and solve problems for themselves and everything, and to stay organized. But it is pretty overwhelming to ask a 7-year-old to suddenly have to fend for so much more, by themselves, instead of having, a teacher or someone who's more experienced be beside them to walk them through things, because I think it does give them that bit of confidence to have their mentor, in person beside them. And of course, parents, they might not be versed in music, so if they can't help the kids. So I think dealing with confidence levels and essentially children trying to figure out how to do things by themselves has been a journey. But I think they're doing pretty well for the situation, and especially for their age. So even if the process is difficult, I'm still pretty proud that they're going through the effort and trying their best. So it's good.
True, and I guess it depends on a lot of you working with them and figuring out how to go about teaching them, because I'm sure maybe every student might be a little bit different too.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And then, attention levels and spans are all very different. But I would say that a good portion of the lesson sometimes is, having to sit down and really verbally explain things that you could maybe point at and get over with, very quickly in a lesson. So the lessons do move slower, but in a way, I guess part of the transition into online is to make sure that your student has kind of the tools they need to think for themselves. So if that means having to step by step walk them through every single detail on the page, maybe it's a good way for them to learn how to do it by themselves in the future. Who knows?
For sure. And it definitely makes me think about what the future model of online education in the arts will look like, because it's not like some traditional classes where it's economics, English, that's more straightforward. But for painting or music or performance, it's so different.
Mm-hmm. A lot of my students are saying, oh, I'm doing my art courses online right now. I'm doing my online painting, I'm doing my online dance, online music, and online everything. And you'd think that sometimes it doesn't work, but it does actually. But I think it depends on kind of perhaps the way it's set up. So I think there is a lot more organizing that needs to be done beforehand. I would say it's more difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think it's a great, solution perhaps to people who can't travel necessarily to get their lessons. This is another, way of getting sort of the art education you need, because you get instant feedback, which is nice. There's just a little bit of setting up to do beforehand to make sure everything's smooth, so you don't have to run around and get things set up and stuff.
It's great to hear that it's working out as best that it can in these times. And I mean, none of us could have predicted this, but it's kind of rising up to the challenge of it. And so are there any previous periods of time where you've had difficulties with creating, whether it's difficult circumstances or other factors?
I would say that although it was never something like the current situation, and of course it was never something that was, super, super terrible, such as me breaking an arm or anything but there have been certain limitations that have made me think about, ways to adapt or to kind of see how I can take those instances to sort of look at things in a new perspective. I have one for music and one for photography. I'll start with the music one because that one happened first. And it was when I wasn't taking care of my body, and my physical setup was so terrible that one problem led to another and then to another. So it was a chain reaction, and it ended up getting to the point where I couldn't play anything for 6 months. And it wasn't necessarily like a broken bone or anything. It was just a nerve thing. And that came from a bad setup and also not handling my time well. So I was practicing too hard in too long of a time without the proper breaks and stuff in between. So that was a good lesson, first of all, in learning how to time manage, so I didn't have that problem in the future. But it made me feel very awful at the time because I realized, in a way that perhaps I was riding my whole existence perhaps on what I was offering and not necessarily on other aspects. So just having that side of you being taken away was, very alienating at the time, especially when it was the one thing that you could relate to with all the other kids in your school. And there was the one thing you're being judged on. And then, it's easy to tie your self-worth into something like that. So I would say that's the one thing that made me kind of try to fill my time in other ways, in the sense that maybe you can always pursue and elevate your own personal study of something, even if you're not able to physically do it. You can read up on stuff, you can listen to things, and you can try to fill in other skill sets at that point. So I would say that was a good lesson, but it wasn't the biggest, problem compared to so many other circumstances perhaps in the world. But that was my first one. And for photography, I would say it wasn't necessarily something physical, but it was more so the limitation of, not having a lot of money at one point, and, kind of losing some as well. And then just the fact that, I wasn't able to replace gear or get the gear I needed to do what I needed to do. So, that really helped me think of ways I could compensate, though, but in a way that made me look a lot into the digital side. And that was kind of how the digital stuff was born a little bit, in the sense that you can compensate for things in a different manner if you have the time for it, and if you can somehow, be smart about it in a sense. But it didn't come that intuitively, in the sense that it is still a learned skill to process things digitally. So I had to really practice to get somewhat proficient at it at first. But I would say that wasn't necessarily adversity or anything, but it was a mildly negative situation at the time. But I'm pretty blessed to say that I've never really had extreme, crisis, I would say, that I had to sort of work to overcome. So I'm very, very much fortunate in that sense.
I'm glad that you found, I guess, a balance from that experience with music and kind of reevaluated, because it's difficult. Definitely, I imagine that you're probably, is it practicing really long hours every day?
Yeah, it definitely was. There was one thing that I did not like about there's actually something I don't like about, perhaps higher education as a whole, which is the sheer body of work they sometimes impose on an individual. And I understand the need for it, because you want every student to be super, qualified, and you need them to go through sort of the trials and tribulations of trying to earn something, which is really true. But, at the time, because our instrument is essentially a tank, it is huge. Piano is a massive instrument. You were at the mercy of whenever those were available. to you. So you would find yourself in the studio at midnight. And because there were fewer people there, you would try to get your hours in for all night and then go to class the next day, and you would feel extremely tired, but that was the one time where you could work uninterrupted. So obviously you would just cram everything at night without sleeping, and then it just ended up not being the smartest thing to do, but it was kind of a way to get by almost at the time. So I think in a way, maybe the opportunity to have healthy time management isn't something that perhaps young adults are taught about, I think, so much in school, because there's just so many requirements and tasks expected of them. And I can also imagine that I didn't take school for photography, but I can probably imagine that, if you're trying to fight for the same resources that the school's trying to offer you, you might have to schedule your time around what's available.
Yeah, and then staying in tune with your body too throughout this time. Because I also remember when I was doing my master's in Oxford that I was sitting for a really long time and started to get spine pains, and that's connected
Yes.
to nerves, and to some nerves even in my head. So getting migraines, nausea, and I didn't realize until I was flying back to Toronto one day, and that plane ride was just terrible because I had to stay seated, and that's kind of when I knew I need to reevaluate how I was working to make it sustainable. But I guess it's important to have these checks and balances, and to have these moments to think, okay, what I'm doing is not working, and I need to, and that it's working for us for most times that we're reevaluating now. And for photography, it's really inspiring to hear how those limitations actually brought a new direction or a new set of tools to your style of creating. When you didn't have that many tools, but then you did more digital elements in editing later on. And so that's nice to hear about how if we can just see from different perspectives, then maybe we can be more creative and good things can come out of unexpected circumstances.
Yeah, I think there's always a way to navigate what's given you. Granted, it might not always be easy or the best choice, but I think if you can see beyond the extra steps you have to take, sometimes you just have to make it happen. And then pretty soon you'll realize that those extra steps become more practiced and more simple to walk through. And that initial difficult learning curve that you need to kind of cross each time, suddenly the bridge becomes much, much smaller. So I think it really, like all things, it's just a matter of finding a plan for how to navigate the problem, and then kind of putting it into practice, and then it almost becomes muscle memory from there. But regarding your spine, this is exactly why I got a gaming chair for my setup, because those are designed for people who sit for a long time.
I love how you have a cape on there too. Just
It's my elf cape.
Just wrap around you and disappear into the chair.
Pretty much.
And so after all of these experiences, thanks so much for sharing, what piece of advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh, I would say that to my younger self that, it's a really good thing that you're trying to learn the value of discipline and stuff, but at the same time, it's okay to kind of not necessarily commit and perform to the top of your ability each time, especially if it's still something that you're just starting or that you're not good at right away because it's new, that it's okay to kind of accept failure for what it is. And in a way, that's my top piece of advice, because I find that sometimes with a lot of children, especially some of the ones I'm teaching right now for music, they're in environments and where they're expected to do so well, and if they even get one or half a letter grade lower on their test or something, they feel like it's a mark on who they are as a person. And a lot of these kids, they go to wonderful, prestigious schools, but then just seeing that sort of comparison with their neighbor who might be some youth winner already with something or something like that. I think that, melting pot of pressure sometimes can really get to young children as well. And I think for myself, being put a lot in that sort of competitive sort of versus environment when I was younger, it was good for my learning and practicing, I think, but I don't think I'm a very competitive person by nature. So it was actually quite taxing to actually be put in that sort of situation and stuff. So I think in a way I would tell my younger self that, it's okay to kind of take the process as it is, and you don't have to speed up your learning for the sake of speeding up your learning. You have to make sure you understand the material first.
For sure, go at your own pace. And then there's so much that's like within our control, but other things that's not. So it's as long as we gave it all, and that's kind of as good as we can do, and that's good enough usually, as long as you kind of think in that headspace of like kind of not having excess pressures and I guess worrying too much about it.
Yeah, I think the other thing just on that note is that, sometimes coming to terms with what is good enough is always hard, because you can see the product and result of a great master online, and then you tend to want to compare, and then it makes you think that perhaps you're lacking in something, and I think the only thing that the person's lacking in is really just experience sometimes, and that you can't necessarily buy that, right? It needs to come on its own. And I think old work that maybe you're not happy with anymore is just kind of capturing you at that moment, of what your best was perhaps, or, what your intention was at the time. So it's easy to kind of be embarrassed by it sometimes. I know I am embarrassed by old work sometimes, but, I've kind of learned to move over that a little bit. I still get a little bit embarrassed, but then I try to mentally move myself away from it and think, okay, this was me when I was 18 or something. This is what I liked. This is what I could do. This led somewhere else. So, I think changing my perspective on that has really helped me in a way, instead of thinking that everything had to be like a masterpiece. And I'm sure that like maybe 20 years from now, look back at my work now and just be like, oh no, and then, because maybe all my tastes might have changed by then, who knows, right? So
that's really well said. And the beauty of it is that there's always a next piece.
True. And I think we're just conditioned as a whole to always think that there's always something that can be better. And and I think in the arts, especially for anything, I always think that that's something that students hear a lot, whether it's in like dance, you can always, make it more challenging next time, make it more complex, or, for piano, you can always make this just next level, right? Or for painting, this could be a bigger masterpiece, everything. I think there's always that ceiling that people tend to put on themselves, or that professionals put on their peers and themselves and stuff, teachers put on their students. And it's good for motivating, but it's also very, in a way, discouraging a little bit, right? But I guess it depends on how you look at it. So
yeah, and not to be like too, I guess, defined by your output, but kind of like the lessons learned from it, and noticing that that's a snapshot of you at that moment in time. I think that's And so wrapping up this section and going into next one, we would love to hear more about projects that you're working on or have kind of recently done.
Well, what I'm working on now, apart from catching up on my outstanding shoots, is I'm kind of drawing down some blueprints for some future shoots they all got canceled because of COVID, unfortunately. So I was supposed to travel to a few different places to make these things happen. And so one of the projects is me going down to South Carolina, actually, and just meeting up with an incredible costume designer and sort of expert in styling period pieces, and just creating larger scale works that don't feature one or two people, but many people, just to create that sort of painterly sort of aspect. So I was really excited to do that in March, and it never came around. So hopefully in the summer, if travel opens up, and that would be something really exciting. Otherwise, we'll have to postpone that as well. And for music, I'm currently working on recording some pieces for certain composers who would like to have these pieces put on Spotify and then just released elsewhere and stuff. So we're trying it a little bit non-traditionally. Instead of going into a physical studio, we have to do everything at home, so it's a little bit tedious that way, but it's the way of the world right now. So
I would love to listen to more of your musical works on Spotify too.
Oh, cool. I don't actually have my stuff on Spotify right now, but
they come out.
Yeah, in the future I will link you, but I do have other stuff floating on the internet. It's just haven't been on Spotify yet, so that'll be a thing.
Looking forward to that. And so what's a project that you've seen in the wider community these days that you've particularly found inspiring?
I think I forget, unfortunately, the name of the photographer who started it. I will have to look that up and send that to you, but he was doing kind of portraits, FaceTime shoots of other photographers who were holding up signs saying, either phrases to motivate themselves or how they're feeling and all that stuff, and just kind of having a very raw images of people in their personal space holding up signs. And it was a large collection, actually, and I thought that was very interesting in the sense and how cohesive it was and how different all the messages were. And it kind of was a little window into each person's individual situation at the time. And I've been seeing a lot of also FaceTime photo shoots and stuff, creative ones pop around, which is a nice way of, I guess, creatives kind of getting the itch out and connecting with others who they can't physically meet at this point right now, which is amazing. And also another project that I'm not doing, but that I'm a tiny bit involved in that I thought was really interesting was a few of my friends are putting together a coloring book, and they're utilizing faces from their friends and other artists and stuff to then turn into characters that are fantastical in nature, and just to add a little bit of drama and life into kind of just the bleak situation right now. So my friend Mylin Sarli is running that. So I think it's such a cool idea just to have like a coloring book being put together featuring beautiful things and people that are contributing to the community as well.
That's awesome. We'd love to get the links for that and just to see like what are things that make do in this situation and kind of connect still somehow and create together. That's really
great. And there's lots of live stream concerts as well happening now. So that's really something that people can enjoy, their favorite artists at home. And I think that's always very generous considering that, most artists, if they sell tickets, you would have to pay to listen to them, but they're offering, their free concert online. And I think that is just something awesome.
For sure. And so to wrap up on our conversation, what's something that you're grateful for today?
Oh, today I am grateful that I am healthy, that I am still able to connect with my students and, my family and my friends during this time, and that, life apart from being stuck at home is still, smooth and, not really interrupted. So I'm just really happy that I don't have more difficulties, being put on top of me right now at this time, and that, everything is it's blessed the way it is.
Yeah, things will eventually we will find a way in time together. And in the meantime, it's really great to hear such inspiring stories of your journey. Thank you so much for joining us today. And
thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation. And I also want to say a huge thank you to Kohei. Without him, this would not have been possible either. So thank you both so much.
Thank you, Kohei.
Guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. We would love to hear your thoughts or questions. Please let us know in the comments and review section, and we'll try to cover it in the next sessions. If you enjoyed this content, please share and subscribe for more episodes. For latest updates, follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Art Focus Exchanges.